There was a time when cameras flashed, the crowds roared, and money poured into the doors of World Changers Church International as if the flow was unstoppable. It was a golden era. Behind the polished sermons, the global influence, and the carefully curated image of success, however, something darker was silently brewing, a reality no one inside the ministry dared to acknowledge. Now, after years of whispers, warnings, and visible cracks forming in the foundation, the fall of Creflo Dollar's empire is no longer a mere rumor. It's a collapse unfolding before our very eyes. What you're about to hear is a truth that many within the WCCI community hoped would remain buried forever. For decades, World Changers Church International stood proudly among the most recognizable names in American megachurch culture. To the outside world, it appeared untouchable, an immaculate institution with a glittering sanctuary, millions of global partnerships, and a television presence that reached the farthest corners of the globe. And at its center, a pastor whose name became synonymous with prosperity itself. But today, we pull back the curtain and reveal a very different story. A story whispered about behind closed doors, hinted at by former members, and painstakingly exposed by critics long before the public ever began to notice the smoke rising from within the ministry. You're about to hear how a church that once promised hope, abundance, and life-changing transformation ultimately became the epicenter of financial scrutiny, plummeting membership, leadership struggles, and a series of internal fractures that no one could have anticipated, least of all those within the ministry itself. What's about to unfold is the hidden pressure that quietly eroded the foundation of World Changers Church International, pressure points that went unnoticed for far too long. You'll be stunned as we reveal the shocking turning points that pushed WCCI to the brink. The truth is, this collapse didn't happen overnight. It's been years in the making, a slow unraveling masked by charismatic sermons, packed conferences, and an outward image of prosperity. But as you'll soon see, this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, one no one saw coming. Before the controversy, before the questions flooded in from all sides, before the world started to wonder what truly lay behind the polished doors of World Changers Church International, there was a time when Creflo Dollar seemed utterly unstoppable. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, he wasn't just building a church, he was constructing an empire. It was an empire that merged spiritual authority with corporate sophistication, transforming WCCI into a powerhouse admired by millions and feared by many who dared to question it. Back then, Creflo Dollar was spoken of in the same breath as major cultural icons. His sermons dominated television airwaves, his conferences were packed to the brim, and families traveled from across states just to be in the electric atmosphere of the sanctuary. Every Sunday service felt like a highly choreographed production. Every sermon seemed meticulously crafted to elevate the brand. And every new building project was seen as a tangible sign of God's favor, a divine endorsement of the church's rapid expansion. But behind the scenes, something else was brewing, something many of the early members now identify as the first red flag. As the ministry expanded, so did the expectations placed on the congregation. Giving, which was once encouraged, gradually morphed into something more, something that wasn't just a suggestion but an unspoken requirement. It wasn't enough to simply contribute. It became part of the culture, a barometer of faith, and a standard by which commitment to the ministry was measured. The more the empire expanded, the more the message shifted toward financial obedience, toward sowing into leadership and a belief that wealth was not merely a blessing but a spiritual responsibility. At first, this didn't seem alarming. People were excited, they believed in the vision. It felt bigger than life itself. But growth at this scale is never simple, and for every empire that shines brightest, there is always a shadow, a darker side that lurks beneath. Even in the early days, a few former staff members recall moments when cracks started to form behind the glittering image. These were cracks no one dared speak about publicly. Because the truth was this: as WCCI grew, so too did the pressure building beneath the surface. Pressure that would eventually give birth to decisions, behaviors, and financial practices that didn't quite add up. Pressure that transformed what started as a ministry into a machine that required constant feeding. And that pressure, slowly but surely, would play a significant role in the ministry's downfall. This is where the story begins to shift. Because while the rise of WCCI was impressive, what came next revealed a much darker, more complicated side of the ministry, one that no one expected to see so clearly. The early 2000s marked a turning point, a moment many inside the ministry remember vividly. The church was still growing, still radiating an image of unstoppable momentum and still projecting the sense of invincibility that had been built over decades. But beneath the surface, a quiet unrest was beginning to rise. It started small murmurs from longtime members, odd financial decisions that didn't quite make sense, and concerns that were often brushed off as mere attacks from the enemy. Yet as time went on, each unanswered question grew louder. Each uncomfortable moment added weight to a foundation that was already starting to shift. For years, Creflo Dollar had preached a message centered around prosperity, abundance, and the power of financial faith. This wasn't unusual. Many large ministries used similar language. But what set WCCI apart was the scale, the intensity, and the unrelenting expectation of giving. Former members began describing moments when offerings felt less like an act of worship and more like pressure. Campaigns that once centered around spiritual needs now focused on financial goals. And slowly, the promise of material blessings began to overshadow the deeper, more spiritual messages that had originally brought people to the church. Then came one of the ministry's most controversial moments, a moment that would follow Creflo Dollar for years, the push to acquire a luxury aircraft for ministry travel. To some supporters, this seemed entirely reasonable for a global leader, but to critics, the optics were damaging. Headlines began questioning the ministry's priorities. Detractors accused it of extravagance, of prioritizing personal luxuries over spiritual needs. People who had quietly wondered about financial stewardship now found themselves speaking out, no longer willing to remain silent. You could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Leaders defended the decision, claiming it was necessary for the advancement of the gospel. Members who questioned the purchase were often told they lacked faith or misunderstood the vision. But the damage had already begun. The outside world was watching with narrowed eyes, and inside the church, members were asking themselves a question they had never dared to voice aloud. What exactly is happening to world changers? This moment wasn't the collapse, not yet, but it was the first major crack, one that exposed just how fragile the image of invincibility had become. Because once people start questioning the direction of a ministry, they begin to notice everything else they had ignored for years. Attendance patterns began to shift. Financial commitments started to fluctuate. Longtime members quietly stepped away. And with every exit, the once thriving community felt just a little less unified, a little less invincible, and a little more vulnerable. But the real unraveling was still ahead. What happened next wasn't just about money, image, or controversy. No, the true unraveling came from within the leadership itself. And when it hit, it shook the entire ministry in a way that no one saw coming. As public controversies grew louder, something far more dangerous was happening behind closed doors. For years, WCCI had operated like a well-oiled machine, its leadership appearing unified, loyal, and deeply committed to the vision. But former staff members later revealed that the inside of the ministry was nothing like the calm, spiritual order projected on stage. Instead, it was filled with tension, fear, and an internal pressure that only grew more intense as the cracks in the public image began to widen. Insiders remember leadership meetings that were less about spiritual planning and more about damage control. Decisions were no longer driven by a commitment to community growth or spiritual impact. They were shaped by optics, finances, and the desperate need to maintain a public image that was already beginning to fade. And when leaders operate out of fear instead of clarity, instability becomes inevitable. But what truly shook the very foundation of World Changers Church International was the growing divide between Creflo Dollar's inner circle and the rest of the ministry team. According to those who were close enough to observe, the conversations gradually shifted from how do we help people to how do we protect the brand. Staff members who dared to ask questions were quietly sidelined, some transferred, silenced, or simply replaced. Others, disillusioned by the growing corporate culture, walked away on their own, feeling that the ministry had become more about maintaining an empire than about nurturing spiritual growth. Still, the silence from within the walls of WCCI spoke louder than any sermon ever could. Former employees describe a culture where speaking up felt dangerous, where transparency was rare, and where loyalty was expected even when things didn't make sense. This created a new kind of pressure on Creflo Dollar himself. Pressure not only to maintain control but to stay relevant and to ensure financial strength, even as the foundation beneath him began to shake. Tensions came to a head when several long-respected leaders quietly, or in some cases abruptly, left the ministry. These were not minor figures, these were individuals who had shaped the very structure of the church for years, people with influence, vision, and deep insight. Their departures sent shockwaves through the congregation, raising questions that no one on stage was willing to address. Then came a moment no one expected. A leaked internal message, circulated only among select leaders, hinted at financial strain, declining membership, and long-term sustainability challenges. While it never reached the wider public, it spread like wildfire among the inner staff. For many who saw it, the truth became undeniable. WCCI was no longer what it once was. Its growth had slowed, its influence had waned, its internal unity had cracked. This was the moment when loyal members started to feel that something was shifting. They couldn't explain it, but they could sense it, an atmosphere that no longer radiated confidence or stability. Even the sermons began to change. The energy on stage felt different. Creflo Dollar, once a dynamic and magnetic presence, seemed heavier, more guarded, and less certain. Members whispered about it in hallways, parking lots, and Bible study groups. Something was off, and everyone felt it. But this was just the internal storm brewing. The external one, the one that would push the ministry to its breaking point, was still on the horizon. When it hit, it exposed a truth that even Creflo Dollar could no longer control. What came next sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of World Changers Church International. If the internal tensions were the quiet storm, the public unraveling became the thunder that finally commanded everyone's attention. For years, the ministry had weathered waves of criticism, financial scrutiny, and the constant debate surrounding prosperity theology. But in the mid to late 2000s, something began to shift in a way that even the most loyal supporters could no longer ignore. The loudest alarm didn't come from the media. It came from the very people who had once filled the sanctuary week after week. Longtime members noticed the change first. Attendance began to dip. Younger families who had once flocked to the ministry were slowly drifting toward newer, more modern churches with different leadership styles. Critics argued that the culture of polished perfection no longer resonated with a generation craving transparency over tradition. Then came the era of social media, a force that reshaped every major church in America. Sermon clips were no longer confined to the sanctuary or television broadcasts. They were clipped, reposted, debated, and often misinterpreted online. What was once a controlled environment was now open to global scrutiny, and the smallest misstep could ignite a viral firestorm. One of the most talked about moments came when Creflo Dollar publicly reversed his long-held stance on tithing, urging believers to rethink the teachings he had championed for decades. Supporters hailed it as growth, critics called it a confession, and the internet branded it a contradiction. Regardless of how it was interpreted, the impact was undeniable. Some members felt confused, others felt betrayed, some felt validated. But one thing was clear: the foundation of the ministry's message was now being questioned from all sides. With every new viral clip, every Twitter debate, every YouTube commentary, WCCI found itself thrust into the center of conversations it could no longer control. The ministry that once dictated its own narrative now found itself reacting instead of leading. The pressure intensified as well-known religious analysts and former insiders began offering their own commentary online. They discussed the shifts in the ministry's attendance, the direction of its teachings, and its long-term vision. They weren't accusing, they were simply observing. But the weight of their observations added fuel to a fire that had already been smoldering for years. For the first time, the public began asking a question that once seemed unthinkable. Is World Changers Church International losing its influence? Even its supporters felt the tension. The once vibrant atmosphere around the ministry now seemed subdued. Some Sundays were full of energy, while others felt noticeably quieter. The ministry was still functioning, still broadcasting, preaching, and standing, but the energy had changed. The momentum had slowed, and the once dominant presence of WCCI in the megachurch culture now felt uncertain. But the most shocking shift wasn't in attendance, it was in perception. The aura of invincibility had cracked. The image of untouchable strength softened. For the first time in decades, critics, members, and RS all agreed this was no longer the same ministry it used to be. However, the most dramatic moment was still ahead. A moment that would redefine WCCI's legacy and force Creflo Dollar to confront something he'd long avoided. What came next wasn't a scandal, a headline, or an accusation. It was something more human, more relatable, and far harder for any leader to navigate. A fundamental shift in the world that demanded transparency, adaptability, and vulnerability. By the early 2020s, the megachurch landscape had changed. Congregations were adapting, shrinking, or reinventing themselves. For World Changers, this period became a turning point, when the polished image that had carried the ministry for decades began to collide with reality. This shift didn't come through scandal or sudden revelation. It came through a leader's transformation, one that demanded a new kind of vulnerability. For years, supporters admired Creflo Dollar for his confidence and certainty. Critics accused him of being too polished, too corporate. But now, both groups noticed something different. His sermons grew heavier, his delivery slower. His public presence became less frequent, and when he did speak, there was a weight behind his words that hinted at a leader carrying more than what the public could see. Some saw it as maturity, others as exhaustion. Either way, change was in the air, and even the ministry itself seemed to be shifting direction. As younger leaders began stepping into more prominent roles and WCCI adapted its structure and outreach methods, longtime members started asking deep, heartfelt questions. What does the future of this ministry look like? Will Creflo Dollar continue to lead it the same way? Is this a new era or the end of one? These questions weren't driven by criticism, but by genuine concern and loyalty, an understanding that ministries built over decades eventually face crossroads that can't be avoided. Financial analysts observing trends in megachurches noted a dramatic shift in attendance patterns post-pandemic. Online engagement became the new sanctuary, and older ministry models struggled to adapt to rapid cultural changes. Many churches, even the largest and most respected, faced declines, restructures, or full reinventions. WCCI wasn't collapsing or vanishing, but it was undeniably changing. And for a ministry rooted in consistency and tradition, change often feels like a collapse, not of buildings or finances, but of identity. The ministry that once symbolized boldness and growth now faced the challenge of redefining itself in a world that no longer responded to old formulas. During this period, whispers began to spread. Was Creflo Dollar preparing to step back? No official announcements were made, but shifts in attendance, leadership transitions, and the emotional tone of his messages left the question lingering in many minds. Then came the moment that marked a new chapter, a moment that supporters described as honest, unexpected, and deeply human. In a widely circulated message, Creflo Dollar spoke about personal reflection, spiritual reevaluation, and reconsidering teachings he had once firmly held. He didn't frame it as weakness, but as growth, and yet his words landed with the weight of a quiet earthquake. Supporters were struck by his vulnerability, while critics seized on it as evidence of inconsistency. Observers worldwide paused, realizing they were witnessing a rare moment, the public softening of a leader once known for unshakable confidence. This wasn't a fall, it wasn't a scandal or a confession. It was a realization that the ministry, its message, and its leader were entering a new era. With this shift, the question that couldn't be avoided anymore emerged. What happens to World Changers Church International when its defining voice begins to change? The ministry's future no longer seemed guaranteed. Its identity no longer felt fixed. Its once unshakable influence now rested on uncertain ground. But the defining turning point, the moment that truly redefined WCCI's legacy, came when the world saw something they never expected from Creflo Dollar, a moment of complete openness. A moment where he confronted not the public but himself.